In 1997, a family vanished in the jungle without a trace. 26 years later, the jungle returned something that was never supposed to be found. The forest does not forget the things it consumes. It dreams of them, over and over, until someone comes close enough to listen. It stood where no tree should have grown, at the edge of a ravine that hadn't existed the last time satellite images were updated. The expedition team was 6 days off course, slowed by landslides and a malfunctioning GPS, when they stumbled upon it. The canopy above thinned just enough for daylight to catch its contours. A hulking, deformed trunk, bulging and knotted like a body mid-scream. The bark was not brown or green but pitch black, lacquered with something wet. Fungus, maybe, but not the kind they'd seen before. It glistened even in shadow, clinging to the wood like it had grown from inside it. No birds sang in the clearing. Even the insects had gone silent. When Dr. Leclerc first laid a hand on the bark, she recoiled. "It's warm," she said, wiping her palm against her cargo trousers. "Like muscle." The soil at the base of the tree, if it could be called that, was unnaturally soft, dark as coffee grounds, and hot to the touch. Not geothermal heat, not the kind you expect from volcanic vents. This was different, radiant, rhythmic, almost pulsing. Before we go deeper into the unsettling mystery of the Candias family and the tree that seems to remember them, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep searching through these shadows of history. Every subscription helps us bring more of these hidden stories into the light. It may seem like a small action, but to us, it means everything. Thank you. They set up camp a few meters away, too disturbed to turn back, too drawn in to leave. The rest of the jungle blurred into insignificance. This tree had gravity. While cataloging the outer fungal layers, one of the assistants, Jonas, spotted something odd tangled in the roots, a glint of orange plastic, dulled by time. He knelt, brushing soil away until the object revealed itself. A rusted toy robot, one arm missing, its surface pocked and flaking with age. He turned it over. Faintly, beneath the corrosion, were letters pressed into the back. Luca. Just that, a name, no surname. The team didn't know what to make of it. There were no signs of human activity for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. No trail markers. No discarded wrappers. No fire pits. No bones. Just that one toy, pressed unnaturally deep between the gnarled roots, as though the tree had grown around it, deliberately protecting it, or hiding it. Later that night, the audio recorders picked up something strange. A low-frequency hum, rising and falling just beneath the range of human hearing. When played back, the sound warped into something more tactile. Not a voice, exactly, but a suggestion. As if the jungle itself was trying to exhale a memory. Dr. Leclerc didn't sleep. She stared at the tree for hours, the fungus on its trunk appearing to shift ever so slightly, contracting, loosening, breathing. She whispered once to no one, "It wants us to see." No one asked her what she meant. In the morning, the soil beneath their tents had grown hotter. The air was thick, metallic. The toy had gone missing. No one saw who moved it, or what did. The expedition was only supposed to last 12 days, but that was before the tree. Before the questions it didn't ask out loud but made impossible to ignore. Before the jungle, somehow, started remembering them too. It began like so many stories no one expects to end in tragedy with a photograph. A family of 3, all smiles and sunburned cheeks, standing on the deck of a riverboat with the Amazon curling behind them like a sleeping god. Tomás Candias, a geologist by trade, had been chasing the rumor of a limestone formation untouched by cartographers. His wife, Mariella, a former medical researcher, had taken a sabbatical to join him. And Luca, 5 years old, stuffed toy, clutched tightly to his chest, was along simply because they couldn't bear to leave him behind. They weren't foolish. That's what their colleagues always insisted. Tomás had mapped floodplains for oil companies. Mariella had worked with field teams in Madagascar and Sumatra. They knew the dangers. They brought the right supplies, hired a guide familiar with the river forks, registered their departure with both the embassy and the local station. And yet, none of it mattered. They were last seen in a small riverside town called São Lázaro, loading the final barrels of fuel onto their modified skiff. Witnesses recalled how quiet they were, how the boy kept asking if jaguars could climb trees. Only the wrong ones, his father said, cryptically, before they drifted off into the current. Then nothing. At first, no one panicked. Weather delays were common. Radio signal was spotty. The jungle swallowed voices as easily as it did heat. But weeks passed, then a month. Their guide's family sent word that he hadn't returned either. Helicopter sweeps turned up no sign of a camp. The tributary they were believed to have taken was never properly mapped. No one even agreed on its name. Some locals called it Filho Morto, the dead son. A nickname born from myth, not topography. The official investigation declared them missing, presumed dead. The bodies were never found, no raft, no wreckage. Only the scent of unfinished stories left behind in the minds of those who knew them. Mariella's sister used to say, she sometimes still felt Luca's presence in dreams, mud on his feet, smiling but silent. Over time, the case slipped into folklore. The lost family, the vanishing of the Candias, a favorite tale for tour guides and amateur sleuths. For the people of São Lázaro, it was a warning. Do not chase the river where maps do not follow. But something changed with the discovery of that tree. When news reached Mariella's sister, now long resigned to grief, that a child's toy bearing the name Luca had been found in the roots of a mutated tree far beyond any recorded trail, she went silent on the phone for over a minute. Then she said, simply, he always wrote his name like that. All capitals. With a backward C if he was trying to be funny. A private team was sent to confirm the findings. The results were inconclusive. The soil was too unstable, the tree too strange to examine fully. But the toy was real. Its serial number matched the model given to Luca the year before he vanished. And beneath the flaking rust, etched faintly in a child's scrawl, was the word, home. What does a jungle remember after 28 years? If the dead cannot be found, can they still call out? The answers, it seemed, had begun to surface, but they weren't coming gently. The box was unearthed by accident, wedged between two slabs of stone in a collapsed section of riverbank. One of the research team's assistants had tripped on the exposed corner and assumed it was just another discarded fuel canister. But when they pried it free, flakes of rust rained down like ash, revealing the ghost of a logo barely legible on the lid. Panasonic, the kind of camcorder that hadn't been made in decades. Inside, nestled among decayed foam padding and what looked like molded paper scraps, was the VHS camcorder, its buttons stiff with corrosion, its lens fractured. They didn't expect anything salvageable. Yet the cassette within had somehow avoided the worst of the rot. Someone had wrapped it in what appeared to be waxed cloth and sealed it with fishing line. It had been buried on purpose. It took days before the team located a facility in Manaus capable of handling such degraded media. The footage, when finally extracted and digitized, was warped and flickering. Colors bled into one another. Sound cracked like distant thunder. But even in that chaos, there was something undeniable. The first frames were simple. Hands, adjusting the focus. A child's giggle nearby. The camera panned, catching sunlight breaking through the canopy in thin golden streams. Birds cried from somewhere unseen. Then Mariella's voice, clear but distracted. Luca, stay close, don't wander too far. The date stamp read the 4th of August 1997. The footage jumped. More movement. A view of water slow moving, dark with silt. Tomas's voice, muffled, laughing. The boy, Luca, briefly in frame, holding a stick like a sword, pretending to duel with a tree root. He looked 5, Alive, undeniably real. Then the shift. The laughter faded as the camera turned sharply to the right, toward a dense cluster of trees where something seemed to rustle too heavy for wind. Tomas called out, "Did you see that?" The camcorder zoomed clumsily, trying to find whatever moved. But there was nothing. Only stillness now, and a faint sound. Not silence, not quite, a kind of breath. Deep, rhythmic, impossibly slow, like air being pulled through an ancient tunnel. One of the technicians who analyzed the audio later described it as wind passing through bone. An impossibility, but the metaphor stuck. Luca appeared again, this time standing very still, his face blank, the stick now lowered. Behind him, just for a moment, the foliage seemed to bend inward, as if pulled toward something just out of frame. Then static. Several minutes of corrupted footage followed. Then one last clip. The camcorder, now on the ground, half buried in leaves. From this angle, the view was upside down. A sliver of sky. The edge of a boot. A child's voice whispering, "It's under us." Then a hand reached down, covering the lens. Black. The team watched the tape in silence. There were no answers in the footage. Only fragments. Echoes. The kind of evidence that doesn't hold up in reports, but clings to memory like a stain. The rusted box had been hidden with care. Someone, perhaps all three of them, had known they were not coming back. What they left behind wasn't a message. It was a warning. And no one could agree on what it meant. The map calls it something else if it's labeled at all. A mere tributary, thin and winding, vanishing under the thick canopy before any satellite can follow its path to the end. But to the locals, it has only ever been one thing. Rio do Sussurro, the Whispering River. A name passed down through generations like a bruised heirloom, never written, only spoken in lowered voices around fires, always with that same pause before the second word. As if saying it too clearly might stir something awake. To outsiders, it's just a superstition. A poetic name for a stretch of dark water buried deep in the interior, choked with vines and lined with trees that lean in too close, like eavesdropping giants. But to those who live near it, who've lived near it long enough to know the rhythm of the land, it is something else entirely. It is a place where sound moves differently, where voices echo too far and vanish too quickly, where you sometimes hear things that were never said. No one in São Lázaro goes there willingly. They tell stories, not for entertainment, but as a way to remember what not to do. Like the story of the two cousins who followed a monkey past the bend and returned 2 days later unable to speak. Or the one about the boatman whose engine failed by the old tree stump, who swears he heard his dead mother calling him by name despite her having died 3 towns away. He hasn't been back since. He never will. There is a belief that the trees along Rio do Sussurro remember, not with minds, but with something older, cell deep, root deep. They don't forget what passes near them. They don't forget what bleeds into their soil. If you've ever walked too close, you'll know the feeling. A stillness that isn't peace. A silence that feels like it's listening. This is where the Candias family was last seen. Not on a trail, not near a camp. On this river, heading deeper into the folds of green that no guidebook dares map. Their skiff was spotted once from a high ridge, just a blur of canvas and motion, a boy's laughter echoing faintly up the cliff. Then gone. The rescue parties that followed never reached the exact site. The forest changes too quickly, the river bends in on itself. Compasses fail, tracks vanish. Some who tried returned with strange stories, dreams of fireflies whispering words, of the forest floor pulsing like a heartbeat. Others didn't return at all. One elder in São Lázaro once said, "The jungle is not angry, it is not cruel. It is memory, stretched thin. And memory is patient." The whispering one takes nothing it doesn't keep. Even now, researchers say, the area around the twisted tree pulses faintly at night. The wind there doesn't move the same. It circles. It hums. And sometimes, very faintly, If you stay still enough, it sounds like a child laughing, then crying, then nothing. Some things are remembered longer than others, especially by the places that have forgotten how to forget. It doesn't grow like normal fungus. That's the first thing they noticed. There's no clear sporing body, no fruiting caps, no visible threads of hyphae running along the bark in the patterns that mark rot or decay. It coats the tree, not in patches or rings, but in a seamless, uninterrupted skin mat in shade but slick in texture, like something halfway between leather and oil. The surface feels cool when touched, but beneath the surface, it shifts. Not metaphorically, not poetically, physically, it moves. Dr. Vargas was the first to use the word breathing. She hadn't meant it literally at first, just as a description of the way the black surface seemed to rise and fall, like it was alive to the rhythm of the air. But after 2 nights of observation, the word stopped being a metaphor. In a time-lapse playback from a thermal camera, the tree's surface expanded and contracted every 90 seconds. Regular, predictable, too slow for any known animal, too deliberate for wind. It was as if the fungus was drawing something in and pushing something out, though no gases could be measured, no heat signatures registered. But the motion was real, undeniable. They tried scraping a sample off the trunk. The outer layer came away like wet paint, but the material beneath was denser, fibrous, resistant in a way that suggested will. When placed under a microscope, the sample didn't behave like any known fungal species. It didn't react to agar, didn't respond to heat or light, didn't divide like mold or reproduce like yeast. The cells weren't even cells in the traditional sense. They had walls, yes, but no nucleus, no mitochondria. And yet, they pulsed. By day 3, the smell began. Not foul, not rotting. Something stranger. Metallic, like blood but cleaner. Like iron in rain. It filled the air near the tree, but didn't seem to disperse. A closed loop of scent, as if the fungus was holding it in, or generating it not as waste, but as warning. One of the researchers began having dreams, vivid ones. She saw fields of the fungus, stretching out under an open sky that wasn't Earth's. Structures like trees, but inverted, growing downward into a red horizon. She woke choking, her hands clenched around her throat. She hadn't shared the dreams, not at first. But then another member of the team admitted the same thing. Then another, different images, same feeling, something ancient watching them breathe. The local biologists ruled out the obvious categories. It wasn't parasitic. The tree beneath, though gnarled and warped, was not dying. Its core was alive, strong. It wasn't saprotrophic either. The fungus wasn't feeding on decay. It seemed to be in communion with the host, a mutual presence. Or perhaps something else entirely, not a relationship, but a fusion. "We don't have a word for this," Dr. Vargas whispered in the recording. "It's not a fungus, it's a memory made flesh." By the 4th night, the pulses began syncing with the audio recorders. When the wind stilled and the jungle went silent, you could hear it, a slow rhythm, just beneath the surface. A heartbeat that didn't belong to any living creature they could see. The jungle had always been alive. But this was different. This was something that remembered being buried, something waking up. The cache was discovered in a collapsed grove, a few kilometers from the twisted tree, buried beneath layers of tangled root and waterlogged leaves. The waterproof casing had failed. Time and moisture had done their damage. But inside, pressed together in what remained of a canvas field pack, were 2 journals, one nearly destroyed, the other warped but readable. They belonged to Mariela Candias. The writing begins, steady, neat, clinical. Observations about the surrounding terrain, plant species, river depth, notes on Luca's appetite and Tomas's tendency to overcorrect the compass. It reads like the work of someone still tethered to civilization, still believing the jungle could be measured, catalogued, understood. But as the pages go on, something changes. The margins become crowded with crossed-out words. Her handwriting tilts. Sentences stretch and repeat. Rain every day. Not like storms. Just endless. Quiet. Thin. Like the sky crying slowly. She writes about the riverbanks dissolving under their feet, the way their boots sank deeper each morning. About the weight of water in the air, how nothing dried, how skin peeled and split from constant damp. Tomas, she noted, had stopped shaving. Luca had begun speaking to the trees, nothing alarming at first, just stories, make-believe games, little jokes whispered into the roots. By the third week, Mariella's entries shift tone, less about navigation, more about sensation. She writes of sleep that doesn't restore, of dreams that blur into waking hours, of mud that clings even after washing, that smells sweet, like rot made kind. One passage repeats the same phrase 3 times. The rain doesn't stop, it doesn't stop, it doesn't stop. She describes something strange in Tomas, his silences growing longer, his eyes following things that weren't there. At night, he would stand at the edge of their tarp shelter and stare into the dark, listening. When she asked what he heard, he only said, "The ground is remembering something." She doesn't press him after that. Luca, she writes, began drawing spirals in the mud. Perfect spirals, sometimes dozens at a time, all connected at the center like a web. When she asked him what they were, he said, "They help the tree find me when I sleep." Near the end of the journal, the pages are stained with what looks like mold but smells like iron. The handwriting becomes erratic. One page is entirely blank, except for a single word scrawled in the center. Underneath. The next entry speaks of voices in the wet, of dreams where she walks into a tree and keeps walking through wood, through time, through a tunnel of breathing earth. The final page is half-written. It begins mid-thought. If this is what the river wanted, then maybe it was never about crossing it. Maybe we were only ever meant to. And then nothing. Just a water-stained edge, a rip, a smear of black that looks almost like ink but feels too thick. They say it rained that day too, the day her words stopped, not hard. Just the same gentle drizzle, the same curtain of quiet rain the jungle had worn like a skin for 300 days. Long enough for memories to sink beneath the mud. Long enough to forget where the sky ends and the roots begin. It didn't belong there. That much, everyone agreed. Among the tangled roots of the black tree twisted like ancient limbs reaching toward a sky long since forgotten, something foreign gleamed faintly under the layer of bark. At first, they thought it was bone. Then maybe a shard of old metal, a fragment from some long-dead explorer's equipment. But as they cut gently into the gnarled wood, the shape began to emerge. Bright colors dulled by time, fractured plastic curled inward from heat or pressure, the unmistakable shape of a toy. A robot. No head. One arm snapped off at the shoulder, the edges worn smooth by either time or pressure or something else entirely. Fused to the roots, yet untouched by rot, as if the tree had not consumed it but held it, protected it. There was no soil down there, just wood, solid, dense, alive. Which made it impossible to explain how something man-made, mass-produced plastic, carbon frame, painted decals, could have embedded itself nearly half a meter inside the root system of a tree that, according to preliminary scans, had no hollow center and had likely grown uninterrupted for decades. Maybe longer. They extracted it slowly, with the delicacy reserved for sacred things. The root around it was unnaturally pliable, almost reluctant to let go. It peeled back like softened bark, but beneath it, the imprint of the toy remained a perfect cavity in the tree's flesh, as if it had grown around the object, not just physically, but intentionally. The toy itself was unmistakably old, a 1992 model, the kind sold in supermarket bins and airport gift shops. Luca's favorite, according to his aunt. A cheap thing, but he never let it out of his sight. The missing head, she said, was from a fall off a hotel balcony just days before their departure. He'd cried over it, then insisted the robot was better that way, stronger now. Tests were ordered. Carbon dating yielded strange results. The outer plastic showed signs of environmental exposure consistent with 2 to 3 decades of aging, but the core material tested significantly older, a margin too wide to dismiss as error. Some of the scientists suggested contamination from the tree itself. Others said nothing, unwilling to offer theories they couldn't defend. There were scratches along the robot's chest. Not accidental scuffs, but deliberate etchings made by something sharp. Letters, faint but legible. Home, carved in blocky, childish lines. Underneath that, a single spiral. The same spiral found in Mariela's journal. The same one Luca had drawn in the mud. The room fell silent when they saw it. The implications were too strange, too heavy to say aloud. No one wanted to admit it. That somehow, this toy, this small, broken thing, had not just ended up inside a tree in the middle of an uncharted jungle, but had been placed there, preserved, buried like an offering. Some began to wonder aloud if the tree was not just a living thing, but a remembering thing. That perhaps the fungus, the roots, the impossible warmth, they were part of something deeper. A system not of biology, but of memory. That this tree, in its own way, had kept the boy. Not his body, but his mark. And somewhere in its slow, pulsing core, it still was. The story was almost lost, buried beneath conflicting reports and fading recollections, but it resurfaced in a faded field notebook belonging to one of the original rescue team members. A scribbled name, a location, and a single phrase translated from a local dialect. The jungle is too awake. That name led them to a man who no longer spoke to strangers. He lived on the edge of the river, far from the main settlement, in a house raised on stilts above the floodplain. His real name was unrecorded. Locals simply called him Avo, the grandfather. No one visited him without purpose. He was old even in 1997, when the Candias family came through. And when they asked him for guidance deeper into the interior beyond the Whispering River, he refused. He had seen something there, long ago. That was all he would say at first. But when pressed gently, when shown the photograph of Tomas, Mariela, and little Luca, his eyes changed. Something behind them pulled taut, like a thread long buried being tugged back toward the surface. He remembered the boy. They were kind people, he murmured. But the boy, he asked questions the trees wanted to hear. What he said next was not a story, but a warning delivered then and now in the same hushed tone. That there are places in the Amazon not mapped because they shouldn't be. Not because no one dared, but because no line holds there. The land moves, the sky dims, and memory, both yours and the jungle's, begins to blur. They thought it was just more forest, he said of the Candias family. They thought all jungle is the same. But there are parts that are not sleeping. They are listening, waiting. And when you walk there, you leave pieces of yourself behind. Not footprints, not things, but thoughts, names, faces. He looked past the visitors then, toward the tree line, as if seeing something long buried. The jungle remembers everyone, but some it remembers too well. And if you go in without permission, it doesn't let you leave unchanged, or at all. When asked why he had refused them, he answered plainly, "Because I heard it breathing before they asked." In his youth, he had traveled into the same territory. He returned alone, aged beyond his years, with a streak of white through his hair and a gaze that never quite settled. He claimed that the jungle had spoken to him, not with words, but with memories that were not his. Faces he didn't know, voices whispering things he'd never said. When he awoke in a clearing 3 days later, the soles of his feet were raw, and he was holding a doll that belonged to no one. That was the last time he went. So when Tomas and Mariela asked him for a blessing, for knowledge of the safest path forward, he simply shook his head. "I told them, the path you seek is not a road, it is a wound. and some wounds should stay closed. But they went anyway. And as he watched them disappear downriver, the boy looking back with wide, curious eyes, Avo whispered an old prayer not for protection, but for memory. Because once the jungle decides to keep you, nothing, not even time, can pull you back. 6 years after the disappearance of the Candias family, the jungle took more. By 2003, most people had stopped talking about Tomas, Mariella, and Luca. Official investigations had long since closed. Their case faded into the noise of other vanishings, other misfortunes swallowed by the Amazon. But one man hadn't let go, Lieutenant Jorge Renan, a former military cartographer who had once trained with Tomas during a joint environmental survey. They had shared meals, traded river maps, and even spoken of taking their sons into the jungle together one day. That day never came. And Renan, years later, still felt the absence like a stone in his gut. He assembled a team himself, 4 men, all ex-military, all skilled in survival, tracking, and reconnaissance. They brought nothing excessive, just the essentials. Machetes, rations, dry bags, a single satellite radio, and 3 GPS trackers. Their mission, not recovery, but confirmation. Renan believed that if they could find even one remnant gear, bones, a journal, something that proved the Candias family's last known location, it might bring closure. Or at least silence the part of him that still heard Tomas's voice in sleep. They set out in late June, timed with a narrow break in the rains. Locals offered no assistance. Even paid guides turned the men away. No one would follow them beyond the Whispering River. One old boatman left a bundle of sage on the skiff before they launched and walked away without a word. For 4 days, the radio transmitted routine check-ins, coordinates, notes on weather. One message described a disorienting patch of fog that seemed to move ahead of them like a wall. Another mentioned the trees growing unnaturally close together, like ribs. On the 5th day, contact ceased. Search teams were dispatched 2 weeks later. By then, the rains had returned in full force. The jungle erased their path with expert cruelty. Satellite pings from the GPS units proved erratic, bouncing across implausible locations. The last confirmed signal came from the banks of a nameless tributary near where the Candias were believed to have vanished. Only 2 items were recovered: a single boot, waterlogged and half submerged in mud, and a machete wedged upright in the soil as if placed there deliberately. Both were coated in a fine layer of black mold, dense, velvety, almost furred. When the mold was tested, it exhibited properties unlike common fungi. It emitted no spores, refused to grow in lab cultures, and decayed into nothing within hours of exposure to air. What remained, under microscopic analysis, appeared to be threaded with strands of organic memory protein fragments that pulsed briefly before breaking down. Of the men, no trace was found, no blood, no remains, not even the radio. The jungle had returned to stillness. Some speculated they had simply gotten lost, that they drowned or were taken by animals. But others, those who had lived near the river long enough to feel when it changed, believed something different. They said the jungle had remembered the first family too clearly, that it had been expecting a second. And when they came, it reached up through the roots, through the silence and the fog. And it took them not out of cruelty, but because that is what remembering things do. They gather, they hold, and they do not let go. They weren't supposed to cut into it. The tree, if it could still be called that, had already defied classification. Its bark was obscured by a dense black growth, smooth and undulating like the surface of something breathing just beneath. It was warm to the touch, almost moist, and every attempt to analyze its cellular structure had produced more questions than answers. But curiosity, especially the scientific kind, has always been stronger than caution. It was Dr. Renata Ibarra who made the decision. She had spent 2 decades cataloging rare fungal growths in the Amazon, and believed she had seen it all: bioluminescent mycelium in the Andes, spore clouds that mimic snow, a parasitic fruiting body that grew from within frogs like a blooming heart. But this was different. It didn't behave like fungus. It didn't feed. It didn't reproduce. It simply existed, pulsing with a rhythm that felt uncomfortably like waiting. She selected a spot near the base of the trunk, where the fungal layer appeared thinner. Her assistant steadied the collection tray beneath as she pressed the scalpel in. What happened next wasn't recorded on film, but 3 members of the team witnessed it, and not one of them could fully explain it afterward. The blade did not sink through easily. It met resistance. Not the dry crack of bark or the fibrous give of rot, but something denser. Then, suddenly, the surface split, not in a clean incision, but like skin rupturing under pressure. From the opening, a thick fluid welled up, dark red, not the amber of sap or the milky white of latex. This was blood, or something indistinguishably close to it. It didn't drip, it pushed out, pulsing in sync with the faint movement of the tree's surface. A smell rose with it, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Of something living and violated. One researcher turned away and vomited. Another stepped back and whispered, "It smells like a wound." They gathered what they could. The sample was thick, sticky, and clung to the vial walls like it didn't want to be contained. Under the microscope, it didn't separate or coagulate like normal blood. It moved. Not erratically, but with a strange coordination, as if it recognized being observed. Proteins within the fluid folded in ways they shouldn't. No red blood cells. No platelets. But structure, intentional, impossible structure, remained. Dr. Ibarra didn't sleep that night. She claimed she could still feel the fluid on her gloves, though she had scrubbed them twice. She kept hearing the slow, wet sound it made as it emerged from the tree. Like the earth itself exhaling after holding something in for too long. The cut they made didn't scab. It closed. Slowly, visibly, over the course of hours, the black growth reformed itself, resealing the wound with a softness that suggested not healing, but forgetting. From that day forward, the team agreed. No more samples would be taken. No more blades near the roots. It wasn't fear that stopped them. It was the quiet, unshakable sense that they had hurt something, and that it had noticed. It started with the compasses. At first, the team assumed it was a simple interference, magnetic deposits in the soil, or perhaps a solar flare disrupting navigation. But by the 3rd day near the tree, not a single compass pointed true. The needles spun slowly, as if dragged by an invisible current, then froze in random directions. One moment north was behind them, the next it had vanished entirely. They tried swapping out the equipment, digital and analog. Vintage military models and fresh from the box commercial ones, all behaved the same. A slow, hypnotic drift, followed by paralysis. The jungle around them was unmoved. Still, green, patient. But the tools in their hands told a different story, one where direction had ceased to matter. The GPS systems fared no better. Coordinates placed them in impossible locations, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away, sometimes directly in the center of the Atlantic Ocean. One unit showed them floating mid-air, several meters above their camp, before rebooting itself and displaying an empty grid. No terrain, no river. Just white space, and the blinking of their current, placeless position. The drone feeds, once reliable for overhead mapping, began cutting out mid-flight. The signal would weaken as the machines passed a certain radius from the tree, then vanish entirely. When recovered, the footage was corrupted, distorted by visual noise frames stretched into unrecognizable smears of green and shadow. In some, faint flashes of red bled in from the sides of the frame, like veins growing across the lens. One technician claimed she saw a shape in one of the frames. Not an animal, a silhouette. Still. Watching. But the footage decomposed before it could be analyzed. They tried to chart by hand, drawing lines from known landmarks, pacing their steps. But even the act of mapping became unreliable. Trees seemed to shift positions subtly between outings. Clearings narrowed. Paths turned upon themselves. What had been a straight route the day before curved now in a slow, wide spiral. One researcher marked a tree with red chalk 3 thick slashes. The next morning, the marks were still there, but the tree had moved. 40 meters downhill, to the left of where it had stood. It became impossible to shake the feeling that the jungle was rearranging itself, not rapidly, not with dramatic movement, but gradually, quietly, like a dream changing shape while you slept. At night, they could hear something low and consistent beneath the wind. Not a voice, not quite, but a tone. Faint, and full of directionless movement, like static with intention. One team member, overcome with nausea, described it as the sound of forgetting where you are. Old expedition logs were reread. An entry from 1964, penned by a Brazilian hydrologist, mentioned dead zones of direction where the land erases itself. The entry was dismissed at the time as the result of dehydration and fever. But now, it didn't seem so absurd. The jungle, it seemed, did not want to be known. Not in the way humans needed. It rejected being traced, refused to be laid bare by maps or satellites. And the deeper the team moved into its memory, the more they realized. This was not a failure of technology. It was resistance. Deliberate, measured, patient. Like something ancient was watching them draw lines and smiling as it erased them. It was found wedged between 2 stones at the edge of a dry creek bed, an old plastic case, scratched and clouded, but sealed tight. One of the researchers noticed the unnatural symmetry between the rocks, like they had been placed deliberately, shielding something not meant to be seen but also not meant to be lost. The case came free with a little pressure and a soft snap, releasing a puff of trapped, musty air. Inside, remarkably preserved, was a single photograph. The photo had warped slightly along the edges, time bending it like soft metal. But the image itself remained clear. A woman holding a boy. Her eyes soft and alert, her arms wrapped around him in a way that suggested both love and urgency. She wore a loose white shirt stained near the collar, and her hair, pulled back with a strip of red cloth, clung to her forehead with sweat. The boy, maybe 5, maybe 6, clutched a toy robot in his small hands. The same toy, unmistakably, now rusted and headless, that had been recovered from the roots of the black tree. Behind them stood a tree. It didn't dominate the photo, it wasn't the focus. But once seen, it was impossible to ignore. Thick trunk, gnarled bark, a bulge at the base, as though the roots had grown too fast for the earth to contain. No visible fungus, no black sheen, no pulsing skin, but the shape was eerily familiar. Not identical, but close enough to stir something cold in the chest of everyone who saw it. A precursor. Or perhaps the same tree, long before its transformation. There was something off about the light in the image. The sky overhead was cloudy, but the tree's shadow fell in a direction that contradicted the sun's position. Mariella and Luca were lit gently from the front, but the tree behind them was cast in sharp contrast, as if it existed under different rules. Some thought it was a trick of the camera, an old lens artifact. Others weren't so sure. The photo was dated the 6th of August 1997, just 2 days after the last known transmission from the family's radio. No such photo had ever been included in the investigation files. It didn't match any of the images provided by relatives or found in the original camp. It had been hidden, placed somewhere it might survive, but not be found easily. As though someone had known they would not return, and that the picture needed to wait. One of the researchers wept when she saw it, not for the mother, not for the child, but because of what the image suggested, that they had made it farther than anyone had thought, that they had seen the tree, that they had stood beneath it, and that they had smiled. Some believed it proved nothing, just a moment, captured and misplaced. But others saw it as something heavier, a breadcrumb left for those who might come later, a sign not of survival, but of surrender, of choosing to be remembered in the only way that still made sense, through roots, through memory, through a forest that had never forgotten them. The jungle has always been loud. Insects buzz in relentless rhythm, frogs pulse with sharp, wet croaks, and birds call across the canopy in chaotic patterns that only they understand. But near the tree, that noise thins. It doesn't disappear entirely. There are still the occasional clicks of beetles or the dry rustle of leaves, but it feels subdued, like the forest is holding its breath. And in that hush, something else can be heard. Something that shouldn't be there. It began as an experiment. The team had installed a ring of audio sensors around the perimeter of the site, not just for safety, but to gather environmental data, rainfall, wind direction, animal movement. The recorders ran day and night, collecting terabytes of sound. When they played it back, nothing unusual stood out at first. Just the ambient murmur of the jungle. But on the third night, the lead technician noticed something strange, an almost imperceptible hum buried beneath the higher frequencies. It came at irregular intervals, quiet and long. Barely a whisper. But when isolated and amplified, the shape of it became clearer. It wasn't white noise. It wasn't mechanical. It was tonal. Too low for a human to produce naturally, but too deliberate to be coincidence. More recordings followed. The hum returned again and again, never in the same place, never in the same pattern, but always with that same eerie consistency. It resembled a moan, some said, if you were to drag it backwards through time. Not a cry of pain, not a voice, but something in between, a sound like memory, stretched and twisted. Others said it reminded them of breath trapped in a cave, not exhaled, not inhaled, just waiting. Spectrogram analysis revealed a layered structure. Multiple tones stacked over one another, slightly out of sync. As if more than one version of the sound was playing at once, some faster, some slower, none matching exactly. One researcher suggested it resembled a chorus without voices, a dissonant harmony that wasn't made to be heard so much as felt. There was no identifiable source. No animals in the vicinity emitted sounds in that range. No wind patterns could account for it. The team tried placing directional microphones, hoping to triangulate its origin. But every time they narrowed in, the sound shifted, slipping just outside the arc of detection, like it was aware of being chased. Some of the team began reporting physical symptoms when reviewing the audio. Headaches, vertigo, a sensation of pressure in the chest, like being underwater. One of them described it as trying to remember a dream you never had. The recordings grew stranger the longer they stayed. One file captured a sudden distortion, less a sound than a fold, as if the entire recording collapsed inward for a split second, then resumed. When slowed to 1/10 speed, the distortion resembled speech, not words, shapes of words. A rhythm of syllables that echoed faintly like a forgotten prayer. Eventually, someone asked the question no one wanted to say aloud. What if the sound is not coming from outside? What if it's coming through? Not from the air, not from the soil, but from the tree. From beneath it. From whatever had been buried there, long before the roots, long before the fungus, a sound with no source. Or perhaps too many to count. They hadn't intended to dig. The agreement had been to observe, record, and take only surface-level samples. But the ground near the base of the tree had started to change, softening, pulling away from itself in folds like old fabric. It wasn't erosion, it wasn't decay, it was more like invitation. The soil, once compact and stubborn, now parted with little effort, revealing a hollow beneath the roots that hadn't been visible days before. It was the smell that stopped them first. Not rot. Something older. Earth rich with iron and something sweeter like dried leaves and dried blood. The entrance was narrow, just enough for one person to squeeze through with gear, and led into a shallow cavity barely 2 meters across. The walls were ribbed with root veins, some of which pulsed faintly in the light, and in the center half covered in loose sediment lay the bones. 2 human skeletons, curled, not sprawled. Knees pulled in, arms folded against the chest, heads angled slightly downward like they'd gone to sleep in silence. There were no fractures, no bite marks, no indications of violence or struggle. The bones were intact, weathered but whole, and arranged in a way that suggested not accident, but placement. As if the bodies had been laid there carefully. Or, more disturbingly, had laid themselves down willingly. Their clothing was mostly gone, dissolved by time and moisture, but remnants clung to the wrist bones, fragments of cloth twisted with vines that had begun to grow through the fibers. One body still wore a wedding band, tarnished, warped by pressure, but unmistakably gold. The other had what remained of a cloth bracelet, red and faded, likely handmade. There was no sign of the third, no smaller skeleton, no trace of a child. Samples were taken, carefully. Teeth, bone fragments, a sliver of the ring for material dating. But within hours of extraction, the DNA began to unravel. Not slowly, as would be expected from degraded samples, but rapidly melting away in the lab machines, unreadable. Attempts to sequence the fragments yielded only partial strings, most of them corrupted. One technician said it was as if the samples were actively rejecting identification. They ran it again. And again. But each time, the same result. The bodies were human. Adult. Likely male and female. But nothing beyond that could be confirmed. No familial markers. No origin. Just silence. The cavity itself closed within days. Roots shifted, filling the space. The soft walls hardened again. When the team returned to examine the site, it was gone, as if it had never opened at all. And the third body, Luca's, remained missing. Some held on to hope that perhaps he had survived. Escaped. That he was the one who left the photo in the plastic case, or carved the spiral into the toy. Others believed something else. That the jungle had not taken him in the same way, that it had made a different choice. Because the roots had held the adults with a gentleness that felt too deliberate. As if they were remembered, preserved. But Luca, it seemed, had been kept elsewhere. Or not kept at all. And still, the jungle whispered. The discovery wasn't dramatic. No ritual digging, no eerie hum announcing its presence, just a curious anomaly noted during a routine soil compression scan. The tree's major root system had already baffled the team. It was far more expansive than its size should have allowed, extending outwards in long, thick tendrils that looped back toward the trunk, like they were trying to hold the earth in place. But the scan revealed something stranger, one root diverging downward at a sharper angle, narrower and more rigid than the others. It didn't match the radial symmetry of the rest. It looked misplaced, wrong. When they exposed it, the air changed. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like the jungle itself was leaning in to watch. The root was paler than the others, almost gray-white beneath the fungal sheen. The texture, too, was different, not fibrous, but solid. It didn't bend when pressure was applied. It clicked. One of the botanists ran a field knife along its side, expecting the usual dull scrape of bark. Instead, the blade whispered over the surface, sharp and smooth like worn ivory. "It feels like bone," someone muttered. No one corrected them. The root narrowed as it descended, twisting slightly as it tunneled deeper into the soil. With careful digging, they revealed a small fissure, a hollow space running through its center, as if something had grown around a missing core. It wasn't natural. Roots didn't grow this way. Not even parasitic ones. This was not the adaptation of a plant seeking nutrients. It was mimicry. Memory made anatomical. Inside the hollow, they found fabric. Threads first. Then a small, clumped mass of what appeared to be cotton or wool, discolored and fused with strands of fungal matter. Embedded in it were what looked like fibers from clothing, faded blue and yellow, patterns almost floral, like the hem of a child's shirt. There were no tags, no fasteners, just scraps, held in place by something darker. Near the very end of the cavity, lodged in a narrow crevice, was a tooth. Small, human, white, but tinged at the tip with black. The root of it had calcified strangely, as though partially absorbed into whatever surrounded it. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the botanists reached in with tweezers and extracted it, cradling it like it might shatter. The enamel was intact. There were no cracks, no signs of trauma. It was a baby tooth, cleanly lost. Luca would have been 6 by then. They tested the tooth, but the results followed the same pattern as before. Genetic information degraded rapidly upon removal. In the scanner, the digital model shimmered, glitched, failed to stabilize. It was as if the object didn't want to be looked at too closely. Or perhaps, like the rest of the tree, it knew how to withhold what mattered most. Some began to whisper theories, unofficial ones, that the root was not a part of the tree at all, that it had been formed around something that once had shape and life and memory. Not a vein, but a cocoon. Not a limb, but a cradle. One that grew to remember what it once held. And still, the third root pulsed faintly beneath the soil. Quiet. Patient. Waiting for no one in particular, just for the next to ask the wrong question. The spores weren't supposed to do anything. They were collected purely for classification, stored in airtight containers and monitored under controlled lab conditions. Humidity, light, sound levels, all kept static. Standard procedure. But within 24 hours, something shifted. The first sign came as a change in density. A bloom in the petri dish that didn't radiate outward as expected, but coiled in on itself, folding in layers like petals turning inward. It didn't spread, it gathered. The mycologists watching it disagreed about what they were seeing. One said it was collapsing under environmental stress. Another insisted it was adapting. Then someone turned on the overhead light, and the spore mass shifted. Not slowly, but instantly, like a reflex. It tightened into a rough line, then bulged in 2 places, flattening at the top. The researcher joked that it looked like a face. No one laughed. Further testing revealed something stranger. When the spore cultures were exposed to pure tones, single-frequency audio waves, they responded in visible patterns. A low hum caused the sample to ripple outward in slow pulses. A high-pitched tone made the edges rise, forming peaks. And when a human voice was introduced reading from Mariella's journal, no less, the culture contracted and then expanded, forming a shape that resembled, however crudely, the letter L. They ran the test again. This time with different words, spoken softly, rhythmically. The spores pulsed again. Another shape. A backwards U. Then nothing. For 20 minutes, the culture remained still. Then, unprompted, it shifted into a crude spiral. The room fell quiet. The spiral had become a symbol at the center of everything, etched into the toy. Drawn by Luca, scrawled in Mariella's journal. Now here it was, formed from fungal tissue, in a sterile lab, hundreds of kilometers from the tree it came from. Some called it mimicry. They said spores are sensitive to vibration, that perhaps this species, unknown, undocumented, was simply responding to stimuli in ways that coincidentally resembled something familiar. But others weren't so sure. The patterns didn't just repeat, they evolved. Subtle variations appeared with each exposure, like the fungus was remembering previous sessions and adjusting. One researcher swore that after 6 consecutive trials, the spores formed a shape that looked like a hand. No one else saw it. But no one doubted her, either. They began calling it the dreaming fungus. Not as a scientific term, but as a placeholder for what they refused to name out loud. There was something about the samples that felt aware, not sentient, not intelligent in any conventional sense, but attentive. When they left the lab lights on overnight, the culture was different by morning. Thinner in some places, thicker in others, as though it had rearranged itself while no one was looking. And always, faintly, there was that same smell, the metallic sweet scent that wasn't decay, but memory held too long. One night, the voice recorder left running on the table picked up a faint sound barely audible, just beneath the static. A shape in the noise, repeating, 4 syllables, no real words, just rhythm. Like breathing. Like a name trying to remember how to say itself. Whatever this fungus was, it didn't grow, it recalled, it didn't evolve, it reconstructed. And somewhere, maybe still in the roots of that tree, something was dreaming through it. Not of the future, but of what had already been. They stopped calling it a contamination. That word suggested something uninvited, something that didn't belong. But the longer they studied the fungus, the more the team came to believe it wasn't intruding on the forest, it was the forest. Or at least, an extension of something deeper that had always been there, growing in the cracks between what could be seen and what was remembered. It was Dr. Leclerc who first said it out loud, though not in a formal report. Late at night, seated near the edge of the research tent, voice low, lit only by the orange flicker of a dying camp lantern. I don't think it feeds, I think it listens. There was no need, they had all felt it, that sensation not of being watched, but of being understood. Like the roots beneath their feet weren't just old, they were aware. The theory formed quietly, without the usual bravado of scientific discovery. A slow stitching together of details that refused to stay separate, the toy encased in roots, the tooth buried in bone-like wood, the fungal patterns responding to voices, memories, vibrations, the breath-like pulses that seemed to echo human rhythm. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, the dreams shared across multiple members of the team. Dreams of rooms they'd never entered, voices they'd never heard before, emotions that weren't their own. One researcher dreamed of drowning in shallow water, the weight of unseen hands pressing him down. Another woke sobbing, whispering a name, Mariella, despite never having read the original case files in full. Over time, it became impossible to ignore. These weren't random hallucinations, they felt inherited, like emotional residue, stuck to the minds of anyone who came too close. The fungus, some began to suggest, wasn't a parasite or a symbiont. It was a medium, a record, not of events, but of experience. It didn't preserve bodies, it preserved echoes, traces of fear, sorrow, confusion, fragments of identity too stubborn to fade. The tree, in this theory, wasn't cursed, it wasn't holy. It was haunted not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by impressions so deeply embedded in the biological fabric of the forest that they refused to let go. The jungle, in this place, didn't forget the people it consumed. It kept their last thoughts, their last sensations, like pollen stuck to its breath. When the wind moved through the canopy, it didn't just stir leaves, it replayed memories. That was the most terrifying part, not that the forest remembered, but that it replayed. Over and over, without end. A loop of emotion and silence, sound and stillness. The tree might not speak, but it rehearsed through pulse, through scent, through dreams. And if the fungus could carry fear, could it carry love, regret? Could it store the moment a mother held her son for the last time? Or the instant a man realized he had gone too far into something that couldn't be charted? The forest wasn't angry, it wasn't malevolent, but it was full. Brimming with the emotional remnants of those who had come before, too many of them lost, none of them truly gone. The fungus had no mouth, yet it whispered. The tree had no eyes, yet it watched. They had stepped into a place where memory never died. And it had been waiting for someone to listen. They hadn't come to harm anything. That's what they told themselves at first. They were explorers, scientists, parents curious, yes, but not reckless. They brought notebooks, cameras, soil kits. They followed protocols, mapped routes, documented flora with careful reverence. But the moment they put shovel to ground beneath the twisted tree, the moment steel teeth bit into the damp, black soil, something shifted. The jungle had been patient until then, listening, watching, holding its breath. But it did not forgive intrusion, especially not there. No one could say for certain what they were digging for. Tomas claimed it was to test soil acidity. Mariella mentioned tracing the fungal spread. But there was something else beneath it all, an instinct neither of them could name, only follow. The kind of pull that doesn't feel external but internal, like a forgotten memory urging itself forward. Luca had stood nearby that day, quiet, watching his parents disturb the earth with hands that trembled more than they admitted. He'd drawn spirals in the mud while they worked, murmuring something only the tree heard. They dug less than a meter before the texture changed. Not rock, not root, something denser, smooth. They never reached a conclusion about what it was. The next day, the soil became difficult again. Harder, drier, even as the rain returned. The tree seemed to stiffen, the air thickened. And then the compass began to fail. The signals broke, the voices followed. In the last journal Mariella kept, she tried to stay clinical. She logged symptoms, headaches, vertigo, the recurring dream where the ground breathed and the sky held its breath. But the final pages changed. They became disjointed. Fragments, emotional sketches written in long, slanting lines. She described the feeling of being watched through the bones of the forest. She wrote about whispers that didn't sound like language, but memory exhaling. Her last page was torn. Only the lower half remained, faded with water damage, the ink bleeding outward like veins. Just one sentence was legible, underlined twice. "We shouldn't have broken the ground, we should have let the roots sleep." Those words haunted the team long after they left the site. Because they understood, now, what she meant. The tree wasn't a marker. It wasn't a freak of biology or a symptom of deeper mycelial evolution. It was a lid, a seal, something ancient and slow that had chosen, long ago, to bury what it carried beneath layers of root and silence. Not to imprison but to preserve, not to forget but to keep still. And the expedition had undone that stillness. By cutting, by digging, by asking too many questions with metal in their hands, they had reawakened something that was never meant to be disturbed. Something that didn't rage or lash out, but simply remembered. And remembering, it called back what it had once known: fear, grief, love, loss, pulling it all upward through root and bark and breath, until the very air trembled with echoes. What they had unearthed wasn't a thing. It was a presence, one that didn't want worship or study, only sleep. But now it was awake again. And memory, once stirred, does not return quietly to rest.